Okay, I guess we could get started, and other people might join us still, but I think we have a quorum. My name is Sasha Senderovich, and I'm an assistant professor of Slavic languages and literatures, and also in the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. And I'm here to welcome you all to talk by the translators, Reilly Costigan-Humes and Isaac Stackhouse-Wheeler, who will be talking today about their work translating Serhiy Zhadan, one of Ukraine's most important contemporary writers. We meet online with participants and audience members scattered between multiple time zones and regions of the world. One of our speakers is in New York City after a long day of work as a middle school English teacher in the public schools. The other is already somewhere tomorrow in the early morning hours in Almaty, Kazakhstan, before heading out to teach his students. We may have some people joining us from Ukraine, where it's 4 o'clock in the morning. And there was a discussion in some of the Facebook groups where this event got announced about the probabilities of already being woken up at such an early hour by Russian bombs or kamikaze drones. But this event is hosted here at the University of Washington in Seattle. And the University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Puyallup, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations which included and include generations of artists, poets, storytellers, and singers of songs about this land. Settlers who colonized these lands starting in the 19th century haven't been particularly good stewards of them. So those of you in Seattle this evening know that the city sits in a thick soup of smoke from wildfires that have been raging around the region for weeks. And the long-awaited rain is apparently in the forecast tomorrow. This is the first public event of the year organized by the University of Washington's Translation Studies Hub, which this year is co-led by me, as well as by my colleagues Nancy Boayash of the UW's English Department and Arya Fani of the Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures. And we're also very lucky to work with Anna Learn, our graduate student assistant, a person with admirable tastes in literature and translation. Nancy, Arya, and Anna, you maybe wave somehow or, ping yourself, and great to have you here as well. The Translation Studies Hub was first set up 3 years ago to increase the level of translation literacy, as well as teaching of translation and translation studies across the university. And this year, we pick up from the Hub's previous leadership team, Rich Watts, Hee-Kyung Cho, and Michael Biggins, some of whom are also here, I believe. And this year, we do it with a very special goal to scale up the development of translation-focused undergraduate curriculum across the university. So I'm also pleased to welcome to the talk some of the cohort of 10 colleagues to whom we have recently awarded grants to design new courses, as well as grants to design translation-focused modules for already existing courses. And we'll also thank our dear friend Leah Scheingold, who is also here, I think, for making some of these curriculum development grants possible. You can check out our website and sign up for our newsletter at the link that I just put in the chat. The Translation Studies Hub is funded by and located at the university's Simpson Center for the Humanities. So we thank Caitlin Pielo, Rachel Arteaga, Sierra Grimmer, and Kalia Walker for masterfully running the many aspects of this complicated operation. And of course, also Simpson Center's director, Kathleen Woodward. The Simpson Center is the hub for the humanistic inquiry at the University of Washington, committed, among other things, to helping make scholarly projects accessible to the broader public. The Simpson Center's new podcast, Going Public, is dedicated to exploring public scholarship and publicly engaged teaching in the humanities. Episodes consist of interviews with UW faculty who have been developed who have developed graduate seminars with public-facing elements, and also with UW graduate students who have pursued independent public scholarship projects in their fields. Those of you at this event might be particularly interested in episode 1 with Professor Rich Watts, who ran the Translation Hub for the last 3 years, on activating the risk of failure, translation as public scholarship. And I just dropped a link to that podcast in the chat as well. We also thank this evening's 2 other co-sponsors, the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures as well as the Ellison Center for Russian, East European, and Central Asian Studies. And also one last thank you to our friends at Third Place Books, Seattle's fabulous indie bookstore with 3 locations around town. If you're in Seattle and haven't read the books translated by today's speakers before today's events, displayed here, you are welcome to give them a ring and have them order a copy for you if you don't have one already, and if they don't have one on the shelves. So quick issues of housekeeping, and then we'll get going here. After the introductions, our speakers will speak for about 45 to 50 minutes. After that, we'll have a good 25, 30 minutes for Q&A. All audience members are muted and cannot at the moment unmute themselves, which is a basic feature of large Zoom events. However, you can participate in the Q&A in one of 2 ways. You could either write out a question in the chat, and we will read it aloud for you in the Q&A, or if you'd like to ask a question by voice, you can raise your hand, as in the digital reactions, like I just did now. And when you do that, I will call on you and we will allow you to unmute yourself and ask your question. So now to introduce today's event. I'm also getting, I apologize, I have left out of my notes a very important other co-sponsor. Notice the Northwest Translators and Interpreters Society. I will drop their link in the chat as well. I'm really sorry about this. I wrote these notes before. I will do this when I'm done talking, my oversight. So in his novel Mesopotamia, the title refers to the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv, located between 2 rivers. Serhiy Zhadan gives a spectacular description of Kharkiv that goes on for 5 breathtaking pages. Here's how it starts in the English translation by our speakers tonight. He descended into the valley and then started climbing back out, feeling the city climbing closer as he walked, and its breath becoming more and more palpable as its glow grew more and more intense up ahead of him. Trucks rolled out of the night, delivering fresh vegetables, frozen pig carcasses, grain, cotton, and contraband medicine to markets and warehouses. Some of the tankers had fresh milk sloshing around in their innards. Some had stolen oil. Some hid slaves being transported from market to market, singing their sorrowful songs, wondering who would buy them and where they'd ultimately end up. An endless stream of train cars loaded with fish and timber rolled down the tracks, and sleepy passengers peered out the windows, watching the sun flooding the grass of the outskirts with red flames. Barges filled with coals and ships with armed crews glided inaudibly up the rivers, trying to slip through the morning fog, and the city swelled with light, voices and sounds, rousing people from their slumber and releasing images from their dreams. To me as a reader, the passage encapsulates some of the difficulties with translating this novel, which shifts between registers and modes of speech of its chorus of protagonists. Here we have the beginnings of a description of a city that appears to sound lofty and inspired, while noting things that are disturbing to the eye and to the ear. Reilly Costigan-Humes and Isaac Stackhouse Wheeler are a team of literary translators who work with Russian and Ukrainian, known for their renderings of novels by contemporary authors, including Serhiy Zhadan, Dmitry Lipskerov, and Andriy Lyubka. Their translations have appeared in numerous journals, including Little Star, Trafika Europe, and the Tupelo Quarterly. Wheeler is also a published author. Tonight, they're giving the first of their 2 talks at UW. The second will be next Tuesday, October 25th, at the same time on Zoom, and will be entitled Translating the Eccentric and the Commonplace, and it will focus on Zhadan's novel, The Orphanage, set in the Donbass sometime during the war that Russia has unleashed against Ukraine in 2014. Please come back to that, and I dropped the details for that in the chat. Tonight's talk, which will focus on Mesopotamia, from which I read a short excerpt, is titled Translations That Sound Right, on rendering the Ukrainian writer Serhiy Zhadan into English. And please join me in welcoming Reilly and Isaac to the University of Washington.
Thank you very much, Sasha. We're grateful to you for that thoughtful introduction and for the fact that you read a healthy excerpt from Zhadan to start us off tonight. There's going to be a lot of moments to just let that language wash over us tonight, because that is what provides the motive power, not only for our translation, but for your experience as readers. We're also very grateful, of course, to our hosts at the University of Washington, and to all of you who have spent your valuable time logging in to hear about translation at whatever time of day it might be where you're joining us from. As Sasha mentioned, Reilly is dialing in at an absurdly early hour, and I'm dialing in after managing a classroom full of 8th graders, so any hour I might be awake is an absurd one. Because I started my experience at the School of Education during the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously I've brought a PowerPoint, so I'm going to share my screen so that we can get started.
Yeah, I'd like to just say a few words about Serhiy Zhadan. We have been translating, Isaac and I have been translating his prose since 2015. He's one of Ukraine's major authors, and he was the reason that motivated me to learn Ukrainian, because Isaac and I were both Russian majors in college, and I was so obsessed with his prose that I decided to teach myself to read in Ukrainian. And we have translated Varshilovgrad, then Mesopotamia, The Orphanage, and we recently translated a diary. Serhiy has remained in Kharkiv during the war, and he has provided humanitarian aid for civilians, and he has been helping Ukrainian armed forces during, since February, and he has kept a diary since February 24th, and we translated the first entries from the first 4 months of it. Serhiy has been translated into many different languages, and he probably is most popular in the German-speaking world outside of Ukraine. And I think almost everything he has written in terms of prose has been translated into German also. And there are several other translators of his poetry into English, mostly Verlana Tkach and Wanda Phillips. And they actually translated the poetry from Mesopotamia, and we'll take a look at that at the end of our little presentation here. So, end of our PowerPoint. Isaac.
Thank you very much, Reilly. So, to begin with, as obvious as this may sound, I think we need to start with what translators do. There's a distinct tendency towards what Reilly and I always call breathlessness in discussions of translation. You'll hear metaphors that fail to actually compare translation to anything, or you'll hear loose talk about free translation versus literal translation, which means nothing. Or you'll hear even attempts at earnest conversation by translators about what we actually do often remind me of E.A. Housman's advice for how to write a poem, which is have a pint and go for a walk, which, as a practicing poet, I can tell you many of us would agree is excellent advice, but which doesn't show you what's going on under the hood when a poet works. So I'd like to talk about what goes on under the hood when a translator works. The best description of this that I've ever seen is in James Merrill's poem, Lost in Translation, which I'm not going to read because it's gonna make me cry into my webcam, but I want you to see at the bottom 3 lines here, he's describing looking for a translation by Rilke, and he describes the sun-ripe original felicity that Rilke made himself forego in order to render its underlying sense. The sun-ripe original felicity, to me, is what is irreducible about the source language. I think translators often fetishize that too much, but it's undeniable that there are peculiarities that individual languages have. There's a literary critic who had a great example of this. The phrase bread and wine in German and in French. If you say it in German, if you say Brot und Wein, your eyebrows sort of irresistibly come down like you're a cartoon character character and the animator is trying to prove that you deserve to be taken seriously. But if you say it in French, you wind up with "Hi va." You wind up with a little cloying, nasty rhyme in there. And you wind up, this may be apocryphal, I'm not a student of French history, but you also apparently wind up with a weird association where pain va were the two requirements to be legally classifiable as a restaurant. So that takes us a long way from the spiritual connotations and the lowered eyebrows. That's the sun-ripe original felicity that Rilke made himself forgo. Translation really is an exercise in deciding what to forgo. Another metaphor for this might be deciding what to sacrifice. It's impossible to translate something in a way that reproduces every single worthwhile aspect of the original text. You inevitably have to choose what aspects of that original text need to be reproduced for the reader and which aspects of it can be sacrificed. I think of it as a hierarchy of competing demands, and your value system as a translator is about which of those demands you put at the top of that hierarchy. So as Sasha wisely did at the beginning, I'm going to give us a little bit of Zhadan to get us started, because this is a passage that includes some of the issues we're going to be talking about tonight. This is a monologue by someone who is unhappy in love as only an 18-year-old boy can be. My princess went my song of praise the next morning as I lay there staring sullenly at the ceiling in my wrinkled jeans and stale shirt. Why must you break my heart? Why must you toss it to the pigeons in the square? They play with it, perched up on the city's TV antennas, and I weep, my princess, while you paint your own portrait with only the most vibrant colors. Why do you keep me in these silver chains? Why do you put this black, suffocating collar around my neck and keep me from telling you all my thoughts about love and cruelty? My princess, where do you run off to every morning? In what burrows do you hide from me, you lovely fox? Why don't you return and let me go? Why do you hold me captive? Why don't you ever call me by my name? I sang and sang as the street outside the window awakened. I sang as the building came to life, and I went on singing, not even trying to get out of bed. I guess now I know what it means to be unhappy in love, I thought, despairing. It can be painful, and it can put you in a rotten mood. Who would have thought? Who could have foreseen it? Meanwhile, there was more and more sun, and the voices were getting more and more grating. The building was filling up with them, so I simply didn't have any more time for my suffering. I liked the building. It was like an electric organ. In the mornings, I'd wake to the workers stretching a cable along the cold, damp asphalt and connecting it to the blue waters of electrical current running through the apartment block. The doors were always open, and cold drafts pooled in the hallways, swaying like seaweed as soon as anyone ran inside. After midnight, when everyone was already asleep, if you listened closely enough, you could catch the chittering of mechanical alarm clocks, the dripping of water in the kitchens, the whispering of drowsy pigeons on the roof, and the women sighing quietly in their sleep, as though somebody was tuning all the cords and antennas, preparing for a concert staged to celebrate a holiday. In the early morning, the building would be set in motion, and the first sounds would emerge. Brisk air would whip through the windows and rooms like breath through woodwinds. The floors would creak, perky radio voices would echo, knives, frying pans, razors, and hair dryers would chime in, as well as some toasters, irons, and loud ringtones. Anchormen would deliver the latest news in their sweet, reassuring voices. You could hear dishes. You could hear water, kisses and whispers, people humming marches and reciting prayers, running giddily down the stairs, which finally woke all the balconies and hallways from their slumber. Now it sounded like a piano was scraping across the floor, and you were inside it, in the midst of the deepest sounds, in between the most disquieting notes, listening to the wood and tin, iron and cement, glass and skin that held the floors and ceilings together. When children ran into the building around lunchtime, their high-pitched voices made invisible microphones screech, and booming sound ricocheted off the walls. And this music persisted, wistfully in the afternoon, adamantly at dusk, ecstatically at night, never slackening, never pausing, just going on and on. The music made me want to die. I got right down to it. So aside from its self-evident aesthetic pleasure, I hope, there is a point that Reilly and I are trying to make with that particular passage, which is that Mesopotamia is really a novel of what we call rhymes.
So one of the things that's fascinating about Mesopotamia is that Zhadan drops these little breadcrumbs throughout the short stories, in which one short story is in dialogue with the other, that there are repeating phrases, or there's the same concept or idea, or the characters will interact with each other, or you'll only realize that they've interacted with each other later on once one of the characters references it. And there's some of these rhymes are very obvious, which we'll get to, and some of them are a little bit more subtle. But given the fact that Mesopotamia is a city, on a river, and there's a lot of water imagery in the novel, we felt as though one of the most important ideas and concepts and thematic rhymes throughout the novel was this idea of everything pooling and everything forming. There were a lot of right here. Yeah, we'll get to this. There are a lot of things that had water imagery to them, which realistically can't actually be described in those terms, in empirical terms, I guess. This also works. This contributes to the magical realism of the novel too. We had to be, when we were translating the novel, we had to take very thorough notes on all of the times when there were certain repetition, and also there was maybe a distortion of events, and that's what we'll get to in this on the next slide here, actually, of how differing perspectives of the same event, or there was a twist to a series of events. So let's take a look at the next one. Isaac, the next slide.
So when Reilly mentioned the need to keep those exhaustive notes as we were translating, to go back to the idea of translation as an exercise in foregoing, as an exercise in sacrificing one thing that you might ideally like your translation to achieve to something that it must achieve in order to function. The second Reilly and I appreciated just how shot through with these rhymes Mesopotamia is, that went to the very top of our hierarchy. The moment we encountered one of these rhyming words, the one thing that could never be sacrificed was, if it was this particular word in Ukrainian, it needed to be translated identically every time it occurred, which is a tall order, as any practicing translator will tell you. The same word often has to be translated contextually in order to function at all. That's the playbook for standard literary translation. And it was the playbook that we had to throw out the window in order to make Mesopotamia read in English the way it reads in Ukrainian. Before we get to this idea of pooling, I just want to give you a very striking example of the book in dialogue with itself. So here we have one monologue from Romeo, our lovesick 18-year-old boy that we just heard from, and another from Thomas, who is equally lovelorn, but in a far more middle-aged way. It's which of those you find more dispiriting probably depends on which of those characters you're closer to in age. Romeo: I went to a bunch of shady places, stopped by all the basements and burrows she'd mentioned earlier, paid the Arabs a visit, stuck my head into the Vietnamese joint, became best buddies with the guys that worked at the McDonald's, strolled into the TB clinic and drank, arms intertwined with the patients, ordered champagne at Health, local sauna, lost consciousness in a dark basement across from the synagogue, regained it at a family restaurant, with some kid's birthday party in full swing, by chasing milkshakes with herbal liqueur, asked for directions at the pizzeria, died from cognac fumes in a bar run by some Georgian dudes, and resurrected myself with some Madeira wine in an empty supermarket. So then, a couple of decades later, but no love later, we have Thomas. Then Oya dragged him from one shady place to another. They popped into all the burrows and basements that she could possibly think of. Paid the Arabs a visit, of course, stopped by the Vietnamese joint, naturally, became best buddies with the guys that worked at the McDonald's. They were used to this kind of thing by now. Enjoyed a few rounds, arms intertwined, with the staff of the TB clinic. Tried to order some champagne at Health, the local sauna, but their efforts were thwarted. Reminisced about their respective childhoods in a dark basement across from the synagogue, and looked for escorts at a family restaurant where they were cleaning up the aftermath of a children's birthday party. He spilled a milkshake on his lap and kept trying to scrub the stains out with herbal liqueur. He asked for written directions at the pizzeria and caught some cognac fumes back at the Georgian joint because every other place was closed by then. They had live music, and he performed some Irish folk dances, getting in the waiter's way and driving her into a joyful frenzy. So these are characters visiting the same locations, which is the book in dialogue with itself, but there's also very slight variations on the language used to describe them that are inflected by each character. So where language was identical in the Ukrainian and where it was slightly different was of great concern to us as translators. So as Reilly mentioned, the first example we're going to look at is the idea of pooling. That was a verb that when we encountered it, we needed to translate it exactly that way in English, however difficult that might be in context.
So one thing to keep in mind in terms of this particular verb, there's stoyati. Stoyati in Ukrainian just a lot of times can just mean to stand or to be, or when you're referring to water, it's just that water is in a particular location, and it's very similar. It is denoting that that water is in a particular place. But throughout the novel, there were many instances in which things like darkness were pooling in a particular area, or they were in a particular area. And this came up, if this had only come up maybe once or twice, we could have rendered this of just apartment blocks with darkness that were in the hollows. We could just use to be. But throughout the novel, this somewhat eccentric use of the verb and the fact that there was a lot of repetition, we wanted to draw attention to it by also using a somewhat eccentric verb in English of pooling. Every time we encountered this verb of stoyati, or stoyit, we didn't render it every single time as pooling when we were referring to a car being parked someplace, for example. But when there was a hint at water imagery, or when there was a hint at the idea that something like darkness was taking on the characteristics of water, we decided to opt for the verb pool. So in this first particular section, in this first sentence here, we have apartment blocks with darkness pooling in the hollows between them, like water in the holds of sunken tankers, a Sean interview. So the fact that we have water here in the Ukrainian down here, we really wanted to drive this image home. We really wanted to give the reader kind of a roadmap for understanding the layers of Mesopotamia as a novel, and the fact that you're just being doused with water throughout the whole entire collection of short stories. And this was kind of an introduction to the rhyme of pooling, into the introduction to the rhymes of the novel. Let's go to the next slide.
There's an important point that you made, Reilly, about how this verb in Ukrainian can often just mean that something is somewhere and is not moving. We'd initially considered options like stagnate, or even stand can be used in this sense in English. Eliot has the pools that stood in drains. You can use stand in that sense in English, but this first example shows why no form of the verb to be could work here. We often talk in terms of load-bearing verbs versus grammatical verbs. In English, to be is usually a grammatical verb. It's just there because it's required for a sentence to be readable. A load-bearing verb, or a verb that is doing cognitive work, that is linking two things, in this case, linking the tenor and vehicle of a metaphor. We have the darkness being like water. That cognitive work can't be done by a non-load-bearing word like to be. Reilly and I jokingly call this problem having yourself a bit of a bee, putting huge emphasis on a verb that isn't load-bearing. So what did I do this morning? Well, first I ate breakfast, then I walked down the street, and then I got on the subway, and then I had myself a bit of a bee in the subway car, and then I climbed the stairs. One of those verbs is not like the others. So let's move on to our next example here.
Here also, so greenery and heat were ushering out the month of May. Fresh air was lying on the rooftops and pooling between the apartment blocks. Once again, in terms of any time Zhadan describes the landscape of Kharkiv, and anytime Zhadan is very much the chronicler of Kharkiv, and he packs a lot of love into any description of Kharkiv as a city. Here he's using a very standard verb of lying on the rooftops. This isn't in any way eccentric, but then he makes the transition to he's having the air stand, which is not necessarily overly eccentric in the Ukrainian. This isn't something that is very jarring, but we wanted to give this the air a watery quality to it. So we opted for pooling as a verb in order to drive home this image of the pooling here. Once again.
So let's move on to our third example here,
which Isaac actually read in his introductory passage. So the doors were always open and cold drafts pooled in the hallways, swaying like seaweed as soon as anyone ran inside. So for us, the word seaweed was the key, and it was what I guess emboldened us to opt for pooled, because we wanted to preserve the pooling image and the watery imagery once again, but there needed to be some sort of outside confirmation, I guess, and seaweed was what gave us the confidence to once again go for this verb, which could feel a little bit jarring at times in English.
So moving on from pooling, to, oh, sorry, not moving on from pooling.
Okay.
We have one more.
And by the evening, so this is describing Romeo having a wild night out on the town and drinking way too much alcohol. And he says, by the evening, alcohol was pooling in my blood, rising like thaw water on the verge of flooding the empty streets of this defenseless city. Also, Zhadan uses the word defenseless, or it could be either defenseless or unprotected in certain cases. We decided to go with defenseless in most cases. He refers to a woman's neck as being defenseless at some point. And we opted for defenseless pretty much in all the cases in which this came up. Anyway, getting back to pooling, here once again, there's we're talking about the we're talking. We wanted to add also a somewhat dramatic element to this description, because when Romeo is describing just how much he is suffering because he has drunk himself into oblivion, we felt as though showing the water kind of rising or pooling in his blood would make this point a little bit more salient, and it would round out his suffering and his self-torture, I guess. Isaac, is there anything else you'd like to add about pooling and?
No, in fact, by using the word salient, you've actually pointed towards a very important aspect of translation that we'd like to talk about next. So we are going to move on to another rhyme, but there's a key idea that Reilly and I use when we think and talk about translation that we think is not often given the attention that it deserves in the teaching of translation practice. And this is what we term marked versus unmarked language. So in the School of Education, where I learned to make PowerPoint presentations, I was told that some people are visual learners. I personally am a cloud of words, and it makes me very angry whenever I'm reminded that there is visible reality outside the cloud of words. But I understand that doesn't apply to everyone. So we have a bit of a visual aid here. What do we mean when we say marked or unmarked language? So we have two methods of communication here. On the left, we have an Apple iPhone in a box that you picked off a store shelf among however many identical Apple iPhones. All of these are manufactured in exactly the same way, in exactly the same Foxconn plant. This is the most unmarked form of communication you could possibly imagine. This gentleman on the right from Google image search is not using an Apple iPhone to communicate. He's using something that he has clearly lashed together himself from electronic scrap. But from the look of that hat and those glasses, I'm very confident that I'm going to hear his voice out of that machine, even if it wasn't made in a Foxconn plant. If you were delivering the same semantic content using the iPhone or using the homemade electronic contraption, that content would be being delivered in a way that's either unmarked or marked. So if I were to say, I need a way to call my friend, that would be unmarked. If I said, I got all these waves coming out of my mouth and they're sound right now, but I need them to be electrons because electrons move different than sound does, and my friend's far away, but when he gets them, I need him to be waves again so we can hear him. That's the same semantic content, but it's dramatically more marked. So we were able to start with the idea of pooling tonight because we had a generous audience who came out to hear Translators. When you're dealing with producing a book for an unseen reader to pick up, you can't depend on that generosity. There's the expression, keeping the reader dear is often used. With translation, that's doubly an issue because what linguists call the entropy level of language, the level of chaos the level of deviation from normal speech or writing that you're encountering risks being attributed to the translation rather than to the original. So often it's preferable to use more unmarked language. But for the second rhyme we're going to talk about, we deliberately chose the most marked version of this phrase we could imagine.
So there's in multiple stories, they are referring to this idea of giving, or we opted for the verb administer first aid. So right here we have, what's with the marks on your neck? Kolya asked casually. I cut myself shaving. I see. Kolya is having a conversation with his nephew. I cut myself shaving. I see, Kolya said, nodding. Do you shave every day now? Don't go slitting your throat. It's a good idea to have somebody around who could administer first aid. What if there was nobody there to help? So in terms of this particular phrase, it pops up about 4 or 5 times or even more throughout the novel, and at some of the most strangest instances. It feels as though it's coming out of nowhere in most of these cases. And it's quite jarring in the Ukrainian, and in the English, we wanted to use this particular rhyme as a way to invite the reader to notice other rhymes. And the way you get the way you get the reader to notice rhymes is by making one quite remarkable, and it's sticks out relative to everything else. And that's why we went for the verb administer, because this isn't necessarily, if it were just give first aid, the reader might just gloss over it, kind of skip over this, and not necessarily, it wouldn't necessarily kind of settle into their consciousness. But with administer, we wanted to kind of guide the reader towards and kind of scream at the reader that Zhadan is trying to use these rhymes in order to weave all of the stories together. Because this is, I would say, in terms of the stitching of the novel, this particular rhyme and this particular concept is something that pops up with a great deal of consistency, and you can't help but notice. So let's go to the next one. You're talking about being a man and all that manly nature stuff, Caustic blubbered. Having compassion is the only true mark of a man, and being willing to administer first aid, if it comes to that, that's the only true mark of a man too. So once again, this doesn't necessarily, the phrase administer first aid doesn't necessarily seem to really jibe with the rest of this utterance. You're not really quite sure where this is coming from. Yes, this is a drunken conversation between men who have men who are trying to be very macho but aren't quite pulling it off. So you have to take all of this with a grain of salt. But once again, we had to make sure that we're being as consistent as possible. And in the Ukrainian, it's the same exact phrase of nadate pershu medичну допомогу. So it repeats itself word for word, and we had to make sure to do the same. And also another example here. Well, besides all the stuff about Jesus and the church hierarchy, it says that the greatest danger is hidden in rivers, but the most reliable protection is down there too, because rivers separate friend from foe and partition light from darkness. They protect us from immediate threats and unexpected turns of events. All you have to do is hug the shore and be ready to administer first aid when you're out there on the water. Once again, in terms of the water, it is flooding your brain as a reader, and this particular phrase, it coordinates and resonates a lot better in terms of administering first aid and being out on the water. This was Zhadan's way of kind of pushing the reader towards realizing that there is a great deal of danger just hidden in Kharkiv as a whole and in the water, and it feels as though you're teetering between life and death throughout a lot of the short stories throughout the collection, and so this hint at needing to administer first aid or being equipped to administer first aid, it definitely works with the rest of the collection, and it gives the collection kind of one of its thesis statements throughout, and administering first aid, because either the characters are being attacked by stray dogs, or someone is drowning, or there's a hint at someone drowning. So this is one of these ideas that you have to be able to administer first aid if it comes to that.
So we've had two examples so far. The first was pooling. That's something that's hopefully working smoothly under the hood, perhaps so much so that a reader wouldn't notice it unless they were reading attentively. Then we have one that is laying on the horn rather than working under the hood to make sure that the reader is primed to encounter these rhymes. Let's look at what happens when there's a noise coming from under the hood that is not the way your car is supposed to sound, but you have to translate your car anyway to continue brutalizing the metaphor. Never content with brutalizing one metaphor, I'm going to brutalize a second. I've recently put up some wallpaper in my bedroom, and as a translator and poet, I'm not very good at putting up wallpaper. One of the effects I noticed is when you're trying to work a bubble out of wallpaper by gently nudging it in one direction, you often cause another bubble to emerge on the other side. You can't tinker with one aspect of a complicated system like a translation without affecting other aspects of it. So what happens when you're desperately trying to translate a particular phrase exactly the same way every time it occurs, but English simply doesn't have one phrase that expresses all of the ideas expressed by this phrase in Ukrainian?
So one of the key phrases here is it repeated itself multiple times throughout the collection of short stories, was "У все залежит від нас." So it can be translated in a lot of at times of it depends on us, or it all depends on us. So a lot of times this verb залежит is depend. There's the word залежность, dependency, dependence or dependency. And in English, you'll see from this particular passage here, Mark woke up and touched her skin. Nastya shuddered, but calmed down quickly. She turned toward him. Lying on his stomach, he rested his chin on her lap, considering her suitcase, reaching out to touch her things. It's all up to us, he thought. We can make it happen if we want. I can't change anything now. This is how it's going to be. So in this particular passage, the idea of it all depends on us technically could work in this particular instance, in this particular in this particular monologue, but we noticed that this was a reoccurring theme, a reoccurring rhyme throughout the novel that came up about 4 or 5 different times, if not more, and we had to render it consistently. So we went with "it's all up to us." Because later on, Isaac, let's go to the next slide. Later on, depend as a verb didn't quite work. So death never meets us halfway. It can bide its time and pick the right moment. It stands in crisp emerald grass. invisible and inevitable, observing how casually and imprudently we run into its shadow. Sometimes we're able to slip out of its shadow again, but most times how we react isn't up to us. So here, saying it doesn't depend on us doesn't make a whole lot of sense in English. And also there is this element of fatalism in Mesopotamia and in a lot of Slavic literature. This isn't necessarily unique to Mesopotamia. And the fact that we felt as though this this particular phrase kind of was a little bit more had a little bit more weight to it, and it expressed either a lack of agency or a certain degree or limited degree of agency, or whenever the characters were making kind of bold proclamations about action they were going to take or not take, this phrase cropped up, and it isn't up to us, kind of is hinting at some sort of higher force or higher power, while depend as a verb just wouldn't really hang together in English, even though depend is usually the verb that you would reach for when you're trying to render zależy. Isaac, let's go to the next slide.
We have.
Oh, okay. Yeah, now I see it. Okay. We are doing everything we can. We would like things to go well for you, but how they go is not entirely up to us. So you shouldn't rely on us alone. Most of our woes and crises of faith stem from our own unwillingness to separate our actions into two categories, good ones and bad ones. We have our love, but we don't always use it. We have our fear, and we rely on it more than we ought to. There are two paths in life. One leads to heaven and the other to hell. Those paths often cross, though. Once again, but how they go doesn't depend on us. For us, it felt a little bit limp, and it also didn't necessarily, we had to be consistent with the rhyme.
Also, this is a very interesting expression in the Ukrainian. It says we are doing everything that depends on us, literally.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In English, if we were translating that without consciousness for the rhyme, we would translate it as we are doing everything in our power. And then the next sentence would be, but very little is in our power. But if we were to translate it as in our power, then we would wind up with reaching out to touch her things. It's all in our power, he thought. No, not viable.
Yeah, and also this idea of power felt a little bit too active to us, because these characters very much lack agency, and things happen to them. So this very American idea of assuming responsibility and taking action and being responsible for your own actions didn't quite resonate with these particular characters, and this idea of we are doing everything that we can felt, and then also it being coupled with is not entirely up to us. There is kind of this excuse, and there is this desire to evade some sort of responsibility that is that it very much is wired into the utterances themselves, which furthers kind of the spirit of this particular novel, and then especially when Zhadan ends this short passage by saying that the paths to heaven and hell often cross. He's always tricking you. He's always fooling you, and you're not quite sure where he's going with this. And then at the end, you realize that there's this lightheartedness, and there's this devil-may-care attitude throughout the novel. So power and assuming responsibility doesn't quite really work with this idea of we're going to shed agency, and we're going to kind of give it to the city of Kharkiv, and the city of Kharkiv will kind of send us down one path or another, and we're going to cross paths with other characters. So that's what was so fascinating about these particular rhymes here.
And as we mentioned before, this was a book that Reilly and I were not only co-translating together on the prose side, but we're also working with two very fine translators of poetry. There were two sets of co-translators working on this book, and then those two sets needed to interface with each other in order to ensure that these rhymes persisted across the prose and the poetry. So let's look at this depend upon which so much depends in one of the poems, and then we'll close out. This is one of the poems from Mesopotamia translated by Varlama and Wanda. You touch the atmosphere and disturb the equilibrium. Everything we've lost, everything we've found, all the air that passed through our windpipes, what sense does it all make without our pain and disappointments? What value does it have without our joy? After all, it's all about your fingers. You touch her clothes and know nothing can be taken back. A name spoken once changes the voice, coils around the roofs of words, as you struggle from now on with dead languages, as you attempt to use them to communicate with the living. You touch her things and understand, behind each word, behind each deed, stands the impossibility of return. Courage and sorrow push us forward. Love is irreversible, and we can't decipher most dark prophecies and visions. What happens to us is only what we wanted, or only what we feared. The question is, what will win, desire or fear? The night will ring with music in the web of our fingers. The room will fill with light from the dictionaries we've brought. After all, everything depends on our ability to speak the language of tenderness. Light is shaped by darkness, and it's all up to us. When Wanda and Varlama first translated this poem, the "it's all up to us" that occurs in the last line and in the title was translated as "it all depends on us." They had good reason to do that, because as you can see in the penultimate stanza, we have, after all, everything depends on our ability. So when they were translating this poem as an isolated text, that was the right call. However, when they interfaced with us and it was necessary to repeat this rhyme throughout the text, we actually had to translate the same Ukrainian verb in this poem in two different ways. We needed "it's all up to us" and "everything depends on our ability to speak the dead language of tenderness." So that "everything depends" in that penultimate stanza is the one bubble under the wallpaper that could not be worked out, no matter how you scraped away at it. Like the sculptor who created the lions on that bridge in Budapest and challenged the king to find the one flaw in them, which was that they had no tongues, and he threw himself into the Danube. We didn't throw ourselves into the Danube, or into either of the rivers of Kharkiv for that matter, but there is that "depend" at the end of this poem, and there it sits. So we hope and expect that people come to events like this hoping to talk and to ask questions, not just to hear us torturing metaphors. So we'd like to open it up for some Q&A and discussion to make sure we have ample time for that.